It's a new year, but that old budget impasse is still hanging around. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenberg from the State Journal-Register. It is a new year. The state's still in somewhat of a mess. And with me here to talk about it as 2016 gets off the ground, Charlie Wheeler is back, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program, University of Illinois Springfield, longtime Sun-Times reporter at the State House. Charlie, welcome.
Thank you, Bernie. It's always good to be here.
And a budget expert, so it's always good to have Charlie. Patrick Yeagle is here, reporter for Illinois Times here in Springfield.
Thanks, Bernie.
Good to see you. Okay, state budget. You know, the next budget address for the next fiscal year, which lays out a governor's plan, is set for mid-February. We still don't have a budget for last year, and in the current fiscal year, which began July 1. Charlie, where is this going and what does it mean?
I think what it means is that it's totally unprecedented. We've never had a situation like this before in Illinois history. Up until 1970, when Richard Ogilvie introduced annual budgets, we budgeted on a 2-year basis. But even then, the budget for the 2 years was adopted within the first 6 months of the odd-numbered year. And then the legislature adjourned, they went home and didn't come back unless the governor called them into special session. Richard Ogilvie in 1970 went to annual budgets, and since that time we've always adopted a budget every year, either by the end of the spring session or shortly into overtime. This is the first time we've gone this deep into the fiscal year, now halfway past it, without a budget. And so we're in a situation where it's quite conceivable that the governor will be proposing his FY17 budget before there's an FY16 budget in place.
And operationally, I mean, I know we've got something like 90% of state programs are being funded by court orders or continuing appropriations, and yet 10% are not. Colleges and universities are among, or state colleges and universities haven't gotten any state money for the current fiscal year yet.
And the problem is that the programs that are being funded at FY15 levels at a time when the state's revenues, because of the for half of that fiscal year, the rollback of the tax increase that was enacted several years ago was not yet in place. It rolled back on January 1st, 2015. So half of 15 had this additional revenue coming in. And so we're spending at FY15 levels, even though for FY16, we're going to have something like $5 or $6 billion less money when all is said and done. Which is,
Patrick, I know you have covered various kinds of agencies that are suffering without the state money that they expected, or suffered for a while until some stopgap measures were passed. How much pain is there out there? You know, state employees are still being paid, which is one kind of issue that has allowed this budget impasse to go on, because if state employees weren't being paid under court order, it's very likely everybody thinks this would have been solved a while ago.
Absolutely.
But who's still hurting out there?
Well, obviously, the folks who are still hurting are probably the people who have the least amount of influence in the State House, really. It's the people who run homeless programs, or especially the homeless people themselves. Crisis pregnancy centers, I believe, is another one of those areas. It's just basically the areas that don't have a dedicated lobbyist in the State House are typically the ones
lobbyists that hand out a lot of money.
Well, yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yeah,
a lot of them have dedicated people, but they're not as well funded, perhaps.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. You know, one of the kind of catch points that's making a little news in Springfield just this last week is the city government, the city-owned utility, City Water, Light, and Power in Springfield provides power to state buildings. Electricity, and the city is owed about $9 million, and they say they usually have a lag of 30 days or so, but they're owed at least, they consider arrears $6 million, and they're considering under Jim Langfelder, the mayor's administration, should they do something. They certainly want the legislature to pass something to say, yes, we can pay this now, another special kind of side deal, but is that a way the budget can pass, or what does that mean?
I'm not sure whether the impasse, the depth of it, and the rancor involved between the governor and the House Speaker is going to be susceptible to be cured by the fact that the city's municipal utility is hurting for the funds that the state owes.
Unless they shut off the power to the state, as radio host
Well,
Jim Leach was talking
I
about.
was going
in
to say, I
Springfield
would
one
be
day.
tempted to do that. I would shut it off to the Capitol. I would shut it off to the Executive Mansion. I'd shut off the lights. I'd shut off the power. I'd shut off the sewer service.
Interesting. Yeah.
And tell them, come on, you guys, get down and do the work.
That's right. It wasn't just electric. It's water too.
And pass a bill in the dark, you know.
Yeah. You know,
People say they do that anyway,
Well, yeah.
figuratively.
people who watch the show probably know this, but obviously the big issue is that Governor Rauner was elected and says he's okay with raising taxes at some point, but he will not do it unless we have structural reforms. And he defines structural reforms in many ways, property tax freeze, but a lot of it is tied up with changes in basically lowering the power of public sector unions in particular, collective bargaining rights, let local governments decide not to collectively bargain, prevailing wage, let local governments decide not to pay prevailing wage on local projects. And if those things don't happen, the governor says we're not going to do a budget. And so you've had this impasse, whereas the Democrats say that goes against our core beliefs. And the governor says, I'm against taxes, that's my core belief, but I'll do it, but they won't. And they say, you know, the governor, we have a Democratic legislature and he wants those changes. Who's going to give? Do we have any idea?
I don't really have a good idea. I would have thought that by now the governor would have realized that his chief job, the only thing that the governor and the legislature absolutely have to do, and that all prior governors and legislators succeeded in doing, was enacting a budget. Now there were more than 200 bills that became law, new laws, at the first of the year. Illinois has existed as a state since 1818 without any of those, and we could have gone another year or two. This is the first time we've not had a budget. And as I say, that is the number one priority. And to me, you could look at it and say that Governor Rauner is the biggest failure of any chief executive the state has had because he could not deliver on the number one priority. Now, yeah, he's anti-union. He wants to destroy unions. I understand that. That's his background. But he has to realize that he's the chief executive of a state that includes a lot of unionized people in the public sector and in the private sector who don't share that belief. And so you can't just sit there and pout and stamp your feet and yammer about how bad Mike Madigan is until you get your way. That's not how you do it in a state that has a lot of varied opinions, that's a pluralistic state. It's not just susceptible to, what the one percenters might want.
But his view is Democrats have run the state. Well, we've had Republican
No,
governors.
but see,
I'm just
that's
saying
goofy.
that
ignores
but
history.
without structural change, Illinois will continue to go in its death spiral, which are
that's
words he likes to
baloney.
use. Yeah.
To use a polite term. You just look at the history. Michael Madigan, who's the governor's nemesis, was elected speaker in 1983. Who was the governor? Jim Thompson. He was just starting his third term. What party was he? He was a Republican. Jim Edgar was started office in 1991. Madigan was speaker. The governor was a Republican. And the leader of the Senate, Pate Phillip, became a Republican. The Senate president became Pate Phillip in 1993 for a 10-year stretch. So for all of that time, and George Ryan was in there as governor as well, Madigan, except for 2 years in the mid-90s, led the Democrats in the House. Republicans held the governorship, and things got done. We enacted budgets. We moved forward on various issues, education reform, for example, changing the prison system and corrections. There were a number of significant improvements
Understood.
made because we did not have a Republican governor who dug in and said, I have this ideological agenda, and unless you will break the unions, I won't do anything.
Well, Patrick, the governor, was out of town for a period of time over the holidays, and he didn't say his people just said he was out of the country, and they wouldn't say where. And finally he got back, and after couple of his 6 kids that he and his wife have together combined, he said he was in Spain and Morocco. They rode camels, they slept in tents. He was visiting his kids, and he thought because of the internet or whatever, saying what country he was in or what his children were in would endanger the kids, and that's why he didn't want to say. Do people believe that or care that he was out of the country for like 10 days or so and didn't tell anybody. His people didn't say where.
I don't know. I think it strikes two chords. One is that on the face of it, going vacationing in Spain and Morocco, over the Christmas break doesn't really jive with the everyman image that he loves to, put forward for himself. Driving the VW van around and all that. But on the other hand, the idea that he had to protect his kids and stuff by not telling anybody where he was. They're adults. Come on. If they need to be protected, they can protect themselves. They're adults. I don't know if it. I feel like it was probably just his sense of, well, this is not really any of your business unless you press me on it.
Well, he got pressed because people kept asking when he got back, and he finally said, so we'll see. One of the other things he did, though, and kind of getting back to a budget thing, he comes back at a time when Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, who has been friendly with him but is a Democrat, has had significant trouble because of the Laquan McDonald shooting by African-American man who was carrying a knife but walking that way when he was shot by a policeman 16 times. You've had demonstrations in the city of Chicago. You've got budget problems with Chicago public schools and the city of Chicago and a recent property tax increase. And so Governor Rauner wants Mayor Emanuel's help before the state helps the city. He wants help moving forward his turnaround agenda, the things that would weaken unions in some ways, from Rahm Emanuel. And so they've been sniping at each other. So the governor said he's very disappointed in the mayor. The governor also kept taking swipes in an interview he did in the Chicago area at Speaker Madigan, who again is supposed to be at the negotiating table, and yet the governor is saying, these things are his problem, that kind of thing. What kind of strategy is this, and where will it go? That nobody seems to be talking in ways that would lead to a deal. Or am I saying that too strongly?
No, I think it's true, and that's what I find kind of mystifying. I mean, I suggested a long time ago in a column that I did for Illinois Issues magazine that there was room for compromise if the governor would back off on some of this anti-union stuff. If he wants changes that would be appealing to the business community. In all the years I've covered this stuff, I've never heard the business community complain that their number one issue is we don't have right to work. It was always stuff like workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, tort reform. Those are issues on which I believe Rauner could have dealt with the Democrats.
Well, we did get some kind of agreement on unemployment insurance.
We did one on unemployment insurance that kind of followed the old mold, where business and labor sat down and they worked out a deal that didn't totally satisfy anybody, but they all could live with. The General Assembly ratified it, the governor signed it. That was kind of the common practice back in the days when we had governors who were willing to govern. And so
you seem to have an opinion on this.
But I do, and I find it really very dismaying. I mean, I'm not going to pick up stakes and move to Hawaii or something. But this is a state that has a lot of potential for all the bad mouthing that the governor does. There was a report that came out a year ago or so by Moody's Analytics, and they cited some of the things we have going for us that our neighbors don't. We have an extensive rail and water and highway network. We have a workforce that is higher educated than any of our neighboring states. We have the city of Chicago, which is a world-class city, and it's a magnet for young entrepreneurs. We have all this stuff going for us. And so this is what we should be playing up instead of getting in this kind of fixation that we have to break public employee unions.
Interesting. Well, we will see. Evelyn Sangmanetti is the lieutenant governor, and one of the things the governor said is wrong with Illinois during the campaign is that we have something like 7,000 units of government, and so there was a committee put together to look into ways to consolidate things and lower the number of governments, and they did come out with a report. And Patrick, you think the legislature will act on any of that?
The first half of the report is mostly uncontroversial. It's just local government consolidation, allowing things like townships to be eliminated if they, if they're not.
Which you may say is not controversial unless you're a township official.
That's a good point.
Like
That's
in the 26 townships in Sangamon County.
And that's the reason why those ideas aren't particularly new.
Right.
That's true.
I mean, 20 years ago when I was covering the legislature for the Sun-Times, we debated this kind of stuff.
Right.
But it was always that the people who thought this was a good idea weren't as passionate about it as the people who didn't want to see it happen, namely the township officials.
So we'll see where it goes. But anyway, Pat, you were saying
basically the first half of it, at least to to the people who are not deeply involved in that, it seems less controversial. But the second half is probably likely to arouse some anger. The union folks, especially. The report called for curtailing prevailing wage, making collective bargaining permissive rather than mandatory, letting schools.
Use third-party contractors for
yeah.
things like janitorial
Privatized
services,
services.
privatized services.
Privatizing,
So
yeah.
again, it's kind of some turnaround agenda
Exactly.
and stuff that would also, in other ways,
Right.
dig into perhaps either union workforce or things that they do.
And I thought it was funny that some of the folks I was talking to basically said, this administration doesn't seem to be able to do anything without injecting that, flavor of anti-union,
Right.
basically
Well,
they called it union busting.
And the spokeswoman for Senate President John Cullerton, he's a Democrat. She said, Rakisha Phelan said, called it, they injected a poison pill into it, which is the anti-union stuff. The governor said, well, he of course always talks about it. We're just talking about local control and saving money. But again, it's the same kind of philosophy that he has that is not going to match an overwhelmingly Democratic legislature in most likelihood.
And there was another thing in there, a constitutional amendment that the state will not pass unfunded mandates, but if they do pass unfunded mandates, they have to pass it by a 3/5 majority. I don't see that ever passing. I don't think, maybe I'm totally wrong, but I really don't see anything like that passing.
Well, it also
And what I
depends how
found
you-
interesting too was their definition of unfunded mandate. What they defined as unfunded mandates were all these things dealing with unions and labor relations, the prevailing wage, the collective bargaining, and they define those as unfunded mandates. Now, in all the times that I've been watching, this unfunded mandate usually meant something that the state told a school district they had to do, like teaching about the Irish potato famine. And they routinely...
Or going to gym class.
Yeah.
That's in there too.
Never collective bargaining, which is a state law that was defined as being an unfunded mandate. So I'm thinking to myself, well, what other unfunded mandates are there under this broader definition? Well, there's a lot of environmental regulations that impose costs on local governments. Maybe we should make those permissive too. So if the city doesn't want to follow the rules on garbage disposal, it doesn't have to. They'd save a lot of money. It's the same kind of, as you said, we got to stick this poison pill in. And we have
Well, I was quoting the Cullerton spokeswoman. But
well,
yes.
but I look at it that way too.
Yeah.
Why couldn't they just restrain themselves instead of reflexively sticking in the anti-union stuff? Because some of the other ideas are good. For example, why do we have Capital Township in Springfield that is coterminous with the city of Springfield? Right. One of the provisions or suggestions from this report would be to allow the city to take over the functions of Capital Township.
But that by referendum, there'd have to be a referendum.
Yeah,
and most of the stuff was
from referendum.
Yeah.
And I actually was talking to someone about that. You probably know Bob Gray, who works with the Citizens Efficiency Commission, and he was saying basically a lot of this stuff can already be done. It just has to happen from this, the citizen standpoint. A lot of it's not going to be top-down change; it's going to be bottom-up change. And he said basically there's not a whole lot of evidence that if you enable local governments to do this kind of stuff, that they actually will, or that it will actually save that much money.
Yeah. Well, we will see where that goes. I mean, I've been, Charlie, like you, I've covered the legislature for a while. I remember John Maitland, state senator from Bloomington, going for school consolidation. I remember, great idea, schools should be able to consolidate and, save administrative costs. But boy, just to get two little districts in central Illinois up near Bloomington to consolidate took years and years because everybody wants their football team, everybody has their identity, and it's just, it's never simple.
And in one of those occasions, somebody came up with a line that stuck with me that I think is great. The toughest animal to kill is a high school mascot.
Very good. It is getting to be political season. Just this last week, there were 3 days of filing for presidential candidates and their delegates. So Illinois' primary, we're not sure how significant it's going to be in either party. It depends what happens in the early primaries and caucuses. But we've got, I think, 11 candidates, Republicans for president, and we've got actually a few more than the usual, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side, but also Martin O'Malley and a couple lesser-known candidates, including Willie Wilson of Chicago, who also ran for mayor last year. And on the Republican side, a lot of top people in Illinois, including like Jim Edgar, are for Jeb Bush. So we'll see if that comes up. But we've got Carson, Kasich, Santorum, Huckabee, Fiorina, Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, Bush, Rubio, and I know Darren LaHood, the new congressman from Peoria, is a big Marco Rubio guy. Donald Trump, of course, and Chris Christie. So not all of them have full delegate slates, but I think 8 of them have full or close to full slates. And getting those delegates elected to the national conventions this summer is the big thing that happens in the March 15th primaries with, Republicans elect Republicans, Democrats elect Democrats. Do we think Illinois is going to be a big player in this?
It occurs to me that it's probably too early to tell.
Yeah.
But it also occurs to me that if you just look at the math of it, somebody could, quote, win the Republican presidential primary in Illinois with maybe 11% of the vote.
At this point.
Yeah, with 11 candidates, it's like...
Yeah, and we've often called other than the delegates, the candidates themselves, a beauty contest, but the Democratic Party this year, the state Democratic Party, said that there's like 12 at-large delegates that will be named at the state convention, and whoever wins the statewide beauty contest of just among the candidates themselves will get those 12 delegates
and
on the first
don't they do
ballot.
part of that based on voting in a congressional district?
Well, the congressional district, the Democrats in each congressional district, whoever does better in the beauty contest gets a certain percentage of delegates. So the Democrats can split up delegates. So the 3 top vote getters among delegates in each district on the Republican side will go to their convention. Not necessarily that way on the Democratic side. There's different numbers in each district depending on Democratic strength. And let's say Hillary Clinton gets 60% of the vote and Bernie Sanders gets 40% in a congressional district. Their delegates will be split that way, even if Hillary's delegates all got more votes. It's very complicated.
I know it is.
And hopefully it'll all make sense by the end of the year. One realistic thing, we've had a lot of flooding in the territory. The governor did come back a little early from his vacation to visit flood areas, did say a lot about it's really more of a federal help, but he did call it the National Guard in some places. I think it's the worst flooding we've had since '93, and I don't exactly know how we would rate how the state has done, because I don't know if any of us are experts in that, but I know we probably all know the small towns, we've had a lot of closed roads for a while and hope that things get better. We will go from there. And
well, one of the things that the state has done after '93, we've embarked on a kind of ambitious program of buying land in floodplains, buying out owners whose property is susceptible to flooding to reduce the amount of damage in the future. So I think that made a lot of sense.
And and I know insurance is still a problem because some people who want flood insurance, that's separate from homeowners insurance, so there's a lot of heartache out there just with flooded basements. It can be a terrible thing. There is a kind of a media story that happened by the end of the year. There's something called the Illinois Radio Network, which has been around for years, sometimes under different names. At one time it was Tribune Radio. At one time it was Capital Information Bureau at the State House with Bill Miller was one of the starters of that, I think, and he was then your predecessor running the public affairs reporting program.
He was a legend in Illinois journalism. He was one of the fathers of our Open Meetings Act,
That's
for
right.
example.
So this is a network where there's reporters at the Capitol and 1 or 2 or 3 and reporters in Chicago, and they send out news to a network of stations. So that has been owned by its own kind of business entity. They got bought by the Illinois News Network. Now the Illinois News Network is a project of the Illinois Policy Institute, which is kind of a right-leaning think tank that kind of tends to agree with the governor in a lot of things and got $625,000 from the governor in recent years. So they provide the Illinois News Network free stuff to radio and stations and newspapers. Now they're buying the Illinois Radio Network, which goes to about 50 stations across the state, providing news from Chicago and Springfield. We don't yet know, and they will remain separate entities, but we don't yet know if the Illinois News Network or the Illinois Policy Institute will have an effect on the product of the Illinois Radio Network. They, of course, say it'll be independent and fair. Charlie, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I always get concerned when there's a change in ownership of a media outlet. You wonder, is the new owner going to impose his or her will on the editorial content? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. We'll just have to see with this outfit. I went through something like that at the Sun-Times when Rupert Murdoch bought the paper. And there was a lot of concern. Is Murdoch going to try and trash the Sun-Times? I shouldn't say that. Is he going to try and model the Sun-Times against some of his other properties that were less journalistically sound. Thankfully, that never occurred.
And then he sold it a few years later, right?
Yeah, and it's changed hands any number of times since then. But as I say, that's always a concern. And in the case of the Illinois Radio Network, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens.
We will indeed.
But they've had excellent reporters down through the years. Their current reporter in Springfield, Dave Dahl, is very strong.
Right. Although with this change, he is no longer part of the
now he
network.
works
And
for WTAX,
as we take
right.
this show, I'm not sure who their
Ben Kinningham, another legend.
Right.
Melissa Hahn was another one. Becky Henrietto. They've had really strong people in that bureau servicing smaller radio stations across the state that don't have the wherewithal to have somebody hear themselves. Although part of the problem might be, too, that the number of radio stations actually carrying news has declined from what the heyday would have been.
Also, I will say
decades
Dave Dahl,
ago.
he's remaining with WTAX, which was his other job here, and he still can contribute to the network, but he's not the network's person. We have yet to see who kind of the main network person in Springfield will be. Another big thing that just happened in the last week, President Obama, talked about using his executive authority to limit gun sales. Patrick, you're probably aware that a lot of people have big opinions of that, and yet Illinois law is pretty much where the president is. But any thoughts on changes that will make or not?
I don't know. This is one of those issues, sort of like abortion, where if you have a stance on it, it's probably going to be a very hard stance, and there's not a whole lot of mind changing one way or the other. Like you said, Illinois law is pretty close.
We've been a gun control state up until we were the last state to get concealed carry, only under Supreme Court order, I think.
So I don't see it making as much difference here. But I was at the 2008 NIU shooting. I wasn't actually there, in the building, but I was on campus at the time.
Oh my!
And in that case, that shooter actually got his guns legally too, if I remember correctly. I got to go back.
Which is often part of the argument. Sure. Well, with that, we're out of time, and we'll try to solve that problem another day. Charlie Wheeler, thank you. Patrick Yeagle, thank you. I'm Bernie Schoenberg, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Capitol View.